Hello, it's Grandma Karen. You know what a good stitch and a bad stitch look like now. Today we're going to learn to wind the bobbin. We will be talking about the Bernina 135S. Let's talk a little about thread. We will talk more about thread in several other lessons. I found that some beginners are frustrated when they try to find the start of the thread on a new spool of thread. These two spools have a slit where the beginning of the thread is. I call it the thread tail. On the left thread, the tail is in the slit. With the right thread, I have to peel the paper label back a little to see the slit. If the slit is hard to see, use a marker to make the slit easier to find. When you take the thread off the machine to put it away, this slit is where you can park the thread tail to keep the threads from getting tangled. We will talk about other ways to find the thread tail in another lesson. Before the thread goes onto the spool pin, you may have to pierce the paper label to find the hole. You could just tear the paper off, but there is often useful information on the label, so I don't usually tear it off. Instead, I use a small pair of scissors or a metal nail file and punch a hole in the paper at each end of the spool. Spools of thread come in lots of sizes and shapes. We are going to look closely at the way thread is wound onto spools. The threads in this photo are called stacked threads. The threads form a kind of stack like a smokestack. It is wound onto the spool one row on top of the next row. The rows go up the spool and then back down the spool. Stacked spools need to spin while you are sewing. Look at this ribbon. If I pull from the side of the spool, it comes off straight. If I pull the ribbon from the top or the bottom of the spool, the ribbon begins to twist and twist with each round that it comes off. If the stacked thread is coming from the side, like this spool right here, then it is not getting twisted. It is just staying straight as it goes, and that will give you good tension. It needs to spin when it's coming off the spool. These spools have the thread round around the spool in a different way. The thread crosses over itself diagonally each time it goes around the spool. This is called cross-wound thread. The thread needs to come off the top of the spool so it doesn't twist. It is opposite from stacked thread. The thread does not spin, it just comes off the top. So why do we need to know the difference between these two kinds of thread spools? Because we need to put the spool of thread on the correct spool pin so that it unwinds the correct way. Remember that there are two different spool pins, horizontal and vertical. Some machines, like this one, have both kinds. Some machines only have a vertical and others only have a horizontal spool pin. Stacked thread goes on the vertical spool pin so it can spin around without getting twisted. For some spools, it may make a difference if the spool is spinning clockwise or counterclockwise. Follow the diagrams in your machine's guidebook. Cross-wound threads go on the horizontal spool pin so it can pull off the top of the spool. This stitch note is to help reinforce this principle. If you are having problems with bad stitches or breaking threads, try to follow this. Stacked thread does best on the vertical spool pin. Cross-wound thread does best on the horizontal spool pin. Your sewing machine has two threads. One is called the top thread. It comes from a spool of thread. The other is called the bobbin thread. This is a bobbin. A bobbin goes into the bobbin case and then into your machine. A bobbin will hold a lot of thread, but eventually it will run out and you will have to put thread on it again. You must use Bernina bobbins. Get them from your Bernina dealer. Other bobbins may look similar, but they will not be an exact fit. Here's a stitch note to help you remember something important. It says, using the wrong bobbin in your machine may cause bad stitches, bad tension, and thread jams. Bernina has several types of bobbins. Your machine takes the silver bobbins. The blue arrow is pointing to your type of bobbin. The brown arrow points to an older version of the silver bobbin. It will also fit in your machine. Let me show you how to thread the machine from the vertical spool pin. Pull the spool pin up into place. I will put my stacked thread on here. If the spool is really large, then I can put one of these foam pads or foam discs onto the spool pin first. The spool should be turning clockwise. Let's see if I have it right. It's going clockwise. Turn the spool over. If it's not spinning correct, just go like that. For this spool, it needs to be like that. You're going to take the tail of this thread over to the rear thread guide. You might have to stand up to reach behind your machine to do this, and you're just going to pull up underneath there. Go around the front of this pre-tension disc. There's an arrow on the machine there that's telling you the right direction to go. As you bring the thread over to the bobbin, the thread is crossing over itself right here. And then you're going to take it to your bobbin. And with your hand, you're going to wrap the tail of this thread around the empty bobbin. I'm going to put it on there. And you're going to go in the direction of this arrow. So I'm going to go around it and I'm going to wrap it about 4 or 5 times. Then I'm going to push the half speed button on my sewing machine. You can go back to lesson 5.2 to see how to do that. Okay, now I'm going to push this lever, this engaging lever, over to the left, and I'm going to turn on my sewing machine. Now I'm going to press on the foot control, and that's going to start winding. And it seems to be winding onto there pretty well. If it's not really catching as you go, then wind it a few more times, and sometimes just holding this thread right here as it starts will let it catch and go. And then you're going to just keep going until it is full. When it's full, this engaging lever will pop over. So you can stop also whenever you want. Stop when it's full, but I'm going to just stop now. And when you're done, push the engaging lever back over, and you can pull this up, and there is a little thread cutter right there. Now we're going to wind the bobbin with the horizontal spool pin with our crosswise thread. And first you're going to have this foam pad right here, this foam disc on there. I'm going to take my thread and put it on there. And then I'm going to put this spool disc on here. Your sewing machine came with 3 different size discs. You may also hear me call them spool caps. The spool cap holds the spool in place so it doesn't fly off the spool pin or get tangled. This shows the 3 different spool pins that came with your machine. The caps are placed in front of the spools of thread that I would use them with. So the path is pretty much the same. I'm going to go here, underneath, go around the tension. And this tension disc is what keeps the thread the same tightness. Remember, we talked about tension in our last video, and this needs to be nice and tight as it's going around. Then I'm going to wind it around. And there it goes. When I'm done, push this back, pull it off, and cut my thread. This photo is a close-up of the threading path from the horizontal spool pin that I did with a marker. Maybe this will be a little easier to see. What does a well-wound bobbin look like? This top photo shows you. The thread is even from top to bottom, and it looks pretty tight. The bottom photo shows what happens if the thread is not around the pre-tension to stud correctly. The thread is not stacked evenly, and it's mushy on the bobbin or loose and stringy. You cannot use this kind of bobbin in your machine. It'll have terrible stitches. If you don't have the thread wrapped around the bobbin correctly, it may wind onto the bobbin winder stud instead of around the bobbin. Stop winding the bobbin if you see this happening. Push the engaging lever to the right and it will stop. Take the bobbin off and unwind the thread that is wound incorrectly and start again. Trim off any threads sticking up on the bobbin or going over the edge. They can interfere with the bobbin and also cause bad stitches. Here's another stitch note to help you remember. For better stitches, cut off thread tails close to the bobbin. Do not have thread wrapping over the edge of the bobbin. And now it's time for your homework. Show your mentor that you can do the following things. 1. Show or describe the difference between cross-wound and stacked threads. 2. Put your spool of thread on the correct spool pin using the foam under the spool where needed. Use the correct spool cap if it's needed. 3. Turn the speed down. 4. Properly wind the bobbin. 5. Use the thread cutter on the bobbin winder lever to cut the thread. In our next lesson, we will learn to thread the top of the machine and put the bobbin into your machine. See you next time. And here's a note for the mentor. In our next lesson, you will need thread, a bobbin with thread on it, and the sewing machine. We will learn to thread the top of the machine and learn to thread the bobbin. Having the guidebook handy will be helpful. See the mentor's note for Lesson 6 for thread recommendations. And thank you for helping someone learn to sew.